cinematic story begins. There are moments in the history of music that happen in the dark, backstage, away from the cameras and the carefully managed mythology. Moments that never make it into the official biographies, that the people who witnessed them carry quietly for decades, because what they saw felt too intimate, too human to reduce to a headline. This is one of those moments. Las Vegas, 1969. The neon city burned at its usual temperature, relentless, synthetic, cheerful in the way that empty things are cheerful. The marquees blazed with names bigger than people. And on one of those marquees, in letters tall enough to read from a passing car on the strip, was a single name: Elvis. He had come back. After years of films and contractual obligations and a slow erosion of the urgency that had once made him dangerous, Elvis Presley had returned to the stage. The International Hotel, the Vegas comeback residency, the music world held its breath. But in the same city, staying at the same hotel on a different floor, was another man entirely. Jim Morrison, 25 years old, dark-haired, restless, carrying a weight in his eyes that no photographer had ever quite captured. The Doors were not performing in Vegas that week. Morrison was there almost by accident, or at least that was how it appeared. Those who knew him understood that very little Jim Morrison did was truly accidental. What happened between these two men that night would not become part of any official record. But the people who stood in corridors and heard fragments through half-open doors all remembered it the same way. Two different Americas met in that room. Two different visions of what a performer could be, and neither of them walked out unchanged. Elvis Aaron Presley had grown up understanding, on some cellular level, that the distance between poverty and grace was a single voice. Born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935, he came from the kind of quiet American obscurity the country preferred not to examine. A small house, a close family, a faith that expressed itself through music before anything else. When he sang, something happened to the air around him. People stopped moving. There was a quality to his voice that existed outside the conventional vocabulary of talent, not merely skill, not merely beauty, but the sound of someone telling the absolute truth about longing. By the time he walked into Sun Records as a teenager, Sam Phillips heard a person who had absorbed everything: gospel, blues, country, the full emotional spectrum of the American South, and fused it into something that had never existed before. Elvis did not merely become famous, he became a symbol, a lightning rod for the anxieties and desires of post-war American youth. But behind the phenomenon, there was a person, and the person was more complicated than the symbol. James Douglas Morrison was born 8 years after Elvis in 1943 in Melbourne, Florida. His father was a Navy admiral, a man of authority and institutional loyalty. Jim Morrison would spend much of his life in quiet, unresolvable argument with everything his father represented. He was not, in the conventional sense, a musician first. He was a reader, a thinker, a young man who consumed Nietzsche and Rimbaud and William Blake the way other teenagers consumed radio hits. He arrived at music through poetry, through a conviction that words, arranged with enough intention, could crack the world open and let something true fall through. When he co-founded The Doors with Ray Manzarek at UCLA, the project was always literary at its core. These were not songs designed purely for dancing. They were invitations to a particular kind of consciousness. Questions disguised as music. He was not trying to be loved. He seemed, every time he stepped into a spotlight, to be trying to disappear into something larger than himself. But what that something was, even he, in his most honest moments, could not always name it. By 1969, both men were carrying things the public could not see. Elvis had returned to live performance after nearly a decade away, a comeback that the audiences received with ferocious love. But there was a question he carried onto that stage every night, a question the applause never quite answered. Was he still real? Was what he was doing still true? The films had required a version of him that was polished and safe. The Vegas residency was spectacular, but spectacle and truth are not always the same thing, and Elvis, in the private architecture of his own heart, knew the difference. Jim Morrison that summer was in a different kind of crisis. The Doors had achieved success that Morrison found, at moments, suffocating. He had wanted the music to be dangerous, and it had become a product. He was writing obsessively, notebooks filling with poetry he showed almost no one. He was searching for something he could not define, a deeper room in the house of himself that he had not yet found. Both men, in their completely different ways, had reached the same threshold, and that was the moment everything shifted. The night of August 26, 1969, was not different from any other night on the Las Vegas Strip from the outside. The fountains played, the casinos churned. The tourists moved through the lobbies with that particular dazed expression that Las Vegas produces. The look of people who have voluntarily surrendered their orientation. Elvis had performed that evening to a full house. 2,500 people in the main showroom of the International Hotel, and every one of them had gotten precisely what they came for. He had walked onto that stage in a black, karate-inspired suit that somehow managed to be both theatrical and personal. He had sung with a power that silenced argument. He had worked the room the way only he could, moving between tenderness and explosion, between intimacy and enormity, calibrating the emotional temperature of the audience with an instinct that was almost supernatural. When he walked off stage, the applause followed him into the wings. His dressing room was a temporary palace, flowers, well-wishers, associates filling every available space. Elvis moved through it like a man navigating a familiar current. He shook hands. He accepted congratulations. He smiled the smile that had been photographed thousands of times. But those closest to him noticed something else. He would go quiet, not dramatically, not in a way designed to be interpreted, just quiet, in the way a person goes quiet when they are thinking about something the room around them cannot hold. It was in one of those quiet moments that the knock came. The door opened without much ceremony, and Jim Morrison stepped into the dressing room. He was not alone. He had come with someone, a mutual acquaintance in the music world, whose name has been told differently in different versions of this story. But Morrison himself was immediately the presence in the room. He had that quality, the capacity to change the specific gravity of a space simply by entering it. He was wearing dark clothing, unremarkable. His hair was longer than it had been in the early Doors photographs, fuller. He looked simultaneously younger and older than 25. There was something ancient in his eyes and something unfinished about the way he held himself, as though he had not yet decided what posture suited him. Elvis saw him immediately. There was a beat, just a beat, in which the two men simply looked at each other. The room continued around them, conversations overlapping, glasses clinking, music drifting from somewhere down the corridor. But in that beat, something passed between the king of rock and roll and the Lizard King that was older than both their names. Recognition. Not personal recognition, they had never met. Something more foundational than that. One performer recognizing the specific quality of attention in another performer who takes the work seriously in a way that cannot be faked. Elvis crossed the room. The conversation that followed has been described by those present in fragments, partial sentences, tonal impressions, emotional atmospheres that resisted paraphrase. What emerges from those fragments, assembled carefully, is something more interesting than a celebrity anecdote. It is a portrait of two men telling each other the truth. Jim Morrison, by most accounts, spoke first. He told Elvis that he had been in the audience that night, that he had watched the show from a position near the back, unremarked, that he had come because he needed to see something, though he did not, at first, say what that something was. Elvis asked him what he thought. Morrison paused for a long time. The kind of pause that, in most social situations, would have been broken by the other person. Elvis let it stand. He had, those who knew him well reported, a patience with silence that surprised people. He had learned, somewhere in the long education of his life, that the most interesting thing another person has to say is usually the thing that requires the longest approach. What Morrison said, when he finally said it, was something in the spirit of this: that watching Elvis perform had given him a feeling he did not often get. Not excitement, not admiration exactly, though both were present. Something more unsettling. Something that felt like confrontation. He had watched Elvis take the stage with complete command, with the easy authority of a man who had been doing this for so long that self-consciousness had burned away entirely. And watching it, Morrison had realized something about himself that he had been circling for months without landing on directly. He said, in the version that has come down through the people who were there, something like this: "You make it look like you belong there, like the stage is where you were put. I spend every night trying to figure out if I'm supposed to be anywhere at all." The room around them continued its noise, but in the small radius of their conversation, something went still. Elvis looked at Morrison for a long moment. Those present describe his expression as something close to recognition, the look of a man who has heard, in someone else's words, a thought he has been carrying alone for a long time. He did not respond immediately with reassurance. He did not offer the kind of polished consolation that celebrities often trade in, the gracious professional encouragement of one star to another. What he said was more honest than that, and more unexpected. He said, and this too comes through in fragments, in the partial testimony of those near enough to hear, that belonging on stage was not something he had ever been certain of, that the certainty people saw from the audience was a different thing from what it felt like from inside, that there had been years, long years, when he had stepped onto stages and felt the absolute terror of the question, what if this is not real? What if the voice goes, the connection breaks, and there is nothing underneath? He told Morrison that the only thing that had ever answered that question was the music itself. Not the performance of the music, not the machinery around it. The music, stripped to its simplest form, a voice, a feeling, a moment of complete honesty between the person singing and the people listening. And then Elvis said something that Morrison, by accounts, did not respond to immediately. He said, "The question isn't whether you belong on stage. The question is whether you're willing to be honest enough for the stage to hold you." The room went quiet around them, though the room did not know it. What happened in the following minutes is less clear. The conversation was interrupted. These things always are in rooms full of people, in the specific chaos of a post-show dressing room. Someone needed Elvis's attention. Morrison stepped back. The mutual acquaintance who had brought him reappeared. But before they separated, one more thing was said. Morrison asked Elvis a direct question. He asked him whether he ever felt that what the public needed from him and what he actually had to give were the same thing. Elvis thought about this for a visible moment. Then he said, "Sometimes, not always. But when they match, when what you've got and what they need are the same thing at the same time, there's nothing else like it in the world." And then, because the room demanded it, they moved apart. The evening continued. Las Vegas continued. The machinery of fame continued its enormous, indifferent operation. But Jim Morrison, walking back through the hotel corridor afterward, had something he had not had when he arrived. Not a physical thing. A question. A new question. Or an old question newly lit. What did he actually have to give? Not what the audience wanted. Not what the record label needed. Not what the myth of Jim Morrison required. What was actually there, underneath all of it, when everything else was stripped away? He had been asking versions of this question for years. But something about the directness with which Elvis Presley had framed it, without sentimentality, without evasion, with the plain speech of a man who had been through the fire and come back with something real, had changed the quality of the question. It no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a door. In the months that followed, those closest to Morrison noticed a shift. A new seriousness returned to a deeper register. He wrote more. The Doors recorded what would become some of their most emotionally direct work. Leaner, stripped of theatrical extravagance, focused on the gap between what a performer pretends to be and what they actually are. Elvis moved deeper into the Vegas residency with what witnesses described as renewed purpose. Something in the interior quality of his performances shifted. A willingness to let the voice carry weight without the production carrying it for him. Neither man spoke publicly about their encounter. Some conversations are not improved by the coming public record. Some moments do their real work in the silence they leave behind. Rock and roll is, at its deepest level, a history of people trying to find the authentic moment inside the manufactured one. To answer, in front of an audience, the question the audience itself is really asking, not just about the music, but about whether honesty is possible in a world that rewards performance over truth. Elvis had answered that question in his early years with a totality that changed popular music permanently. Then, the machinery had gotten hold of him. Morrison had entered music already suspicious of that machinery, but by 1969, he was also a product of it, his own rebellion repackaged and sold. What they gave each other in that dressing room was the recognition of someone who understood the specific weight they were each carrying. The particular loneliness of standing in front of thousands and knowing that no one in the room can see you clearly. Jim Morrison died in Paris in July 1971. He was 27 years old. What matters here is not the mythology of that ending, but what he did with the time between Las Vegas and Paris. He kept writing. He kept performing. He kept pushing at the question Elvis had reframed for him, about what was actually there, underneath everything, when the performance stopped. He never fully answered it, but then no one does. The question is the point. Elvis Presley lived for 8 more years. Those who knew him describe occasional moments in his performances where something dropped away, where the production fell silent, and something absolutely unguarded came through the microphone. Something that sounded like the boy from Tupelo who had walked into a studio decades earlier and sung because it was the only honest thing he knew how to do. Whether he ever thought about the young man who had knocked on his dressing room door and asked whether the stage could tell the difference between performance and truth, no one can say. But the music, in those unguarded moments, seemed to know the answer. Fame produces a particular kind of loneliness that no amount of applause can answer. Elvis knew the loneliness of separation, the distance that celebrity carves between a person and ordinary life. Jim Morrison knew a different version. The armor of myth had become its own kind of prison. What they recognized in each other in that dressing room was the loneliness of the stage itself, the ache of being seen without being known, of giving everything in front of thousands of people and walking off into a silence that is somehow emptier for the enormity of what just happened. What they found in that brief encounter was not a solution. It was simpler and rarer. A witness. Someone who understood what it felt like from the inside without needing it explained. Decades later, the music of both men continues to fill the air. The songs travel through time the way only truly honest songs do, because they were made from something real. If you listen to Elvis Presley sing, really listen, past the mythology, you hear a person who genuinely loved music, who brought to it not just talent, but devotion. If you listen to Jim Morrison, past the leather and the legend, you hear something similar. A person searching. A person willing to be vulnerable in public in a way that was, in its own way, deeply courageous. They came from different worlds and expressed themselves through completely different vocabularies. And yet, on one August night in Las Vegas, in a dressing room full of flowers and the lingering electricity of performance, they recognized each other. Not as legends, as two people asking the same question across the span of a single conversation that lasted maybe 20 minutes and left both of them changed. The stage does not belong to anyone. It never did. It is simply a place where certain people are willing to tell the truth, however imperfectly, in whatever language they have available. Elvis knew that. Morrison was learning it. And on one night in Las Vegas in 1969, they sat in the same room and let it be true at the same time. That is the whole story, and it is enough.